Okay, by 11, this is 15.3. It's the last installment of the chapter. It's on Darwin's theories, and it's aptly entitled Darwin Presents His Case. If you haven't had a chance, make sure you go to the course website and go to section 5, chapter 15, right here. And you will see the finches up here, our 3 slideshows, and there's a couple of YouTube videos, some items here, neat little flash video that you want to take in down here, and a funny little Simpsons thing I have for you down here. I'll bring this up at various times while I'm going through this topic, but for now, we'll get rolling. Okay, so Darwin presents his case. The story of Darwin and his trip on the Beagle ends with Darwin returning back home to England and thinking long and hard about what he discovered, what he had seen, and existing scientific literature and insights. It was quite a while before Darwin was willing to publish his manuscript. And it wasn't just Darwin that was looking into this theory of natural selection, where nature is almost a microbreeder of different organisms depending on the environment. Alfred Wallace, 1858, he had similar ideas, and you could think of Darwin and Wallace as working separately yet together on the same theory. But in 1859, Darwin finally did publish his book on Origin of Species, and you can imagine how that one hit the scientific community. You have to really think about the community at the time and just how strong a religious pretense there was. Again, Charles Darwin is the son of a pastor. He had to think long and hard before he delivered what he'd found, because he had to share it. It couldn't be refuted, and the world more or less needed to know. He proposed an idea called natural selection. Now, I do speak more about Darwin than Wallace. They came up with pretty well the same idea, which was that there was a mechanism behind evolution, a sort of almost biological pressure, depending on the environment that you lived in, that would affect how creatures survived, bred, and passed along their genetic material to further the evolution of the species. The big thing you have to remember is, at this time, I think we take it for granted right now, but Darwin didn't know anything about genes. Nothing. Didn't know anything about hereditable traits passed along in the form of genes, much less DNA. That was a story coming up and to be told later. But he had been influenced fairly strongly by Lyell and Hutton, that geological processes could change things over vast periods of time on our planet, such as erosion. When I think of that, I think of, for example, the Grand Canyon. What strongly influenced Darwin's thinking is, well, he'd known about it, and when he got home, he thought even more strongly about it, specifically artificial selection. Artificial selection is the idea that humans, and that's the best example, artificially influence breeding conditions in the environment, that we make it so that critters in our environment have a greater chance of surviving versus not surviving. This happens with animal breeding all the time. I'm going to pop out a little bit to the web and show you what I mean here. The best example, just pop out of this for a moment. The best example is what we call the melanic moth. Now, the peppered moth and the melanic moth are two different versions of a moth with different coloration. So they've got different genes for their coloration. Peppered moth. There we go. And this little critter right here is what we call the peppered moth. And for obvious reasons. Nice peppered appearance, as you see there. Very pretty little creature. Now, the peppered moth, when we look at it in terms of artificial, there we go, artificial selection, I think I can go straight to Google Images for this, is almost a test subject of what was happening in industrial regions, for example, Great Britain at the time. When you look at the peppered moth against a dark colored tree, it stands out very distinctly. The interesting thing is it's not supposed to. Healthy trees are a perfect camouflage for the peppered moth. But if you look down here in this region, you will see the melanic, or the dark colored moth. Much more pigmentation. This moth became almost invisible, fully camouflaged in these trees. It was just another version of the moth which suddenly started to get an advantage because of something that humans were doing. Steam engines, coal-powered generators, coal-powered steam engines. You get the idea. Polluting the environment very, very heavily. The melanic moth on healthy trees where there's lichens is virtually invisible. So the melanic moth is right here, hiding out on these lichens. But on these polluted trees where there's no lichens, it has no cover. This changed the frequency of the survival of this moth, and its survival rates began to plummet. Conversely, the melanic moth here, rather peppered moth here, melanic moth here, this critter, this dark colored one, it started to increase in survival. And what began to happen was an influence that humans had control over, which we call artificial selection. Instead of nature selecting long-necked giraffes over short-necked giraffes, because long-necked giraffes could feed higher in the trees, these melanic moths began to survive because they were darker. But it wasn't a natural occurrence that did this. It was an artificially natural occurrence that did this, that we call artificial selection. When you look at various breeds of dogs, it's natural selection, perhaps at its very clearest. Poodles, for example, I'll just zoom in on our friends here. Poodles, for example, have hair that grows down into the ear canal, and that has to be corrected. You have to take them in somewhat frequently and have their ears cleaned, remove the hair from the ear shaft, otherwise an ear infection is inevitable. You can imagine if poodles were left to wild devices, they had to survive on their own in nature, they simply wouldn't make it. And these traits that we find most admirable in dogs, think of dog shows, are ones that we have intentionally bred by just matching the dogs. For example, large dogs, cute dogs, teacup chihuahuas. This is a very artificial thing. We've been involved in the breeding process, choosing what are the most survivable traits. And in the sense of fitness as in the organism is able to move on and pass along the genetic material by breeding, these animals, we're influencing their fitness quite strongly. We're making sure that they survive. That is the essence of artificial selection. Just pop out of that. So the classic example of artificial selection that you're faced with, it comes up fairly often, is the peppered moth versus the melanic moth. And I always like to bring up the dog breeding example, because I think that's a very successful example to indicate to students, because it's one that we know quite well. So Darwin knew about this breeding process, and it's not just related to dogs. This breeding process happens with plants. We've bred corn for a very long period of time to its current state. The largest hogs, the fastest horses, and cows that produce the most milk. And by today's standards, when we begin to study we study bacteria, when we go and look at the bacterial kingdom, you'll see that antibiotic use is even breeding resistant bacteria, And we're doing the opposite of what we expect. We think that we're killing them, but in fact, we're actually guiding their evolution, making them stronger against antibiotics. And you might have heard that. If you haven't, you heard it here first. So, the breeding of useful traits. Selection being done by humans. That's us. It's hardly natural variation. These aren't traits that were advantages in the wild. They're of advantage to humans, or humans have made a mistake, for example polluting their environment, and it turned out that, well, the melanic moth, the dark one, had an advantage that it wouldn't have otherwise had. But that's our fault. Here's some plant breeding for you. When you look at the ancestral plant to, well, superfoods, all the things that you're supposed to eat at the dinner table, right? Cauliflower, broccoli, there's kale, right? Put that in muffins, that's good for you. Brussels sprouts. When you look at this ancestral plant, it's one that was bred and changed over time and became each of these different selections, these different varieties. And if you think about it, you go to the grocery store, you can still pick up Bronco flour. These two can be combined, and I've had Bronco flour. I never minded, if that's an appropriate term. Bronco flour. It's strange. It's green cauliflower. It tastes fine. It's got a very high nutrient quantity. Bronco flour is an example of humans breeding plants. A second example of artificial selection that I wanted to discuss with you was all the different varieties of corn that you'll see all over the world. Corn itself didn't start as you would have thought. It started as an ancestral plant like this, which was bred over time, and through breeding similar plants and trying to get the corn to be more full and to keep breeding until you started to see a more sort of collected assortment of kernels, as you see here at the end, what we got was the formation of sort of the modern corn on the cob that we all know and love. Now, corn has tremendous variety. When you look at these types of corn, and we often refer to corn as maize, you can see that it's grown all over the world, different conditions, and it's an incredibly diverse plant with a common heritage. But look at how much is on the cob there compared to the grass plant it just began as. We've done similar to this with things like wheat and rye, etc. So that's another example of artificial selection. And artificial selection has been very good because it's helped to feed the planet. Plant breeding. I've been doing it for a very long time, same as animal breeding. Darwin looked at natural selection, and he saw that echoed in the breeding programs of plants and animals, as we've been talking about. He was onto a scientific hypothesis. Now remember, hypothesis is how you think something goes. It's your best scientific proposal. When he began to add up all the pieces of evidence, they pointed towards this theory, this strong idea that there is a selection process. Now, it happens in nature. It also happens artificially. We saw it happening on the farm. More or less. Nice, simple example. Darwin also considered there is a very powerful struggle for existence, and there's competition for all sorts of things. Now, these resources may not come to you right away, but if you think about it, competition for food, competition for space, competition for mates. So that struggle for existence is a key aspect of Darwin's thinking, and he put that in context. There we go. He put that in context with all the little pieces of information. They were all adding up. They were pointing to the same general idea. Now, how is natural selection related to a species' fitness? Interestingly enough, when it comes to fitness, it's bandied around a little bit, But fitness, this isn't how fast you can run in a sporting event, how quick your 100 is, or how good your 5K is. By fitness, what we're talking about is we're talking about reproduction. So if you're fit, you can survive to reproduce. That's really the idea. And if you're fit, your genes will move on to the next generation. Natural selection fits in with that, because natural selection is all about having the correct traits to survive. Ultimately, that leads to reproduction. So the ideas plug into each other, but natural selection is the process, and fitness is more or less the end game, sort of the meaning of life for the animals and all the critters on our planet. Survive, reproduce, pass along your genetic material. Sounds a little mundane, but that's what's happening. It's just a little smaller. There we go. Survival of the fittest is an idea that the most adapted organisms have what it takes to move on, and they've got a greater chance for survival. But remember, it's nature that's selecting the adaptations. If the adaptation turns out to be a very poor one, if you are supposed to be a Snow White hare, but your adaptation is that, well, let's say it's a mutation and you don't turn white in winter, you will stand out in the snow and get eaten. That's not a good adaptation. Those aren't good genetics. You won't survive, because the birds will get you. There's some similarities between artificial selection and survival of the fittest. You can equate survival of the fittest with natural selection, but I always tell my students, be careful, because natural selection is the process where the best adapted survive and reproduce. But just because you're fit, it's not like being physical fit. You have to get that out of your mind. There's some neat adaptations down here. When you look at this camouflage, it's just amazing how that adaptation increases survival. And you wonder, well, how did these come into effect? How is it that this moth here looks a lot like its background? Well, through chance mutations, different combinations. You can think of the ones that weren't brown with the little spots. Those other colored ones had really low survival rates. Let's put it this way. If all that happened in a population was that tall organisms were able to breed, for example, if the short ones never bred, the population would tend towards becoming much larger. It's a breeding process where eventually these are the ones that are really doing most of the successful breeding, and their traits begin to show up more and more. Same thing with this frog that's pretty hard to see here. It blended into its environment so well, it wasn't getting picked off by predators nearly as often. It was reproducing more, it had the better adaptations, and just through sheer odds and reproductive survival rates, this frog and its coloration started showing up in the environment more. It's quite a simple process when you think about it, but it's all about living and moving on to the next generation. Okay. So this is generally a long-term process, right? Hundreds of years, thousands of years. But natural selection, as we'll go on into later units, you'll see that sometimes the process of evolution can happen quicker than you think because of changes in the environment that occur suddenly. One of the quickest changes would have been that peppered versus melanic moth. That happened very, very quickly. It changed the number of organisms you saw in the environment. Now, since that time, the lichens have come back to the trees. The peppered moth has made a comeback. So you could see just how quickly the environment can influence survival rates. And that pushes evolution along at a very quick pace. Descent with modification. When we look at critters on our planet, how they're surviving and they're moving on, critters on our planet tend to live in what we call survival niches, different niches. And a niche is kind of like your place in the environment. So a shark's niche is swimming around the ocean, eating whatever it can find, pretty well seals, for example. When you look at the giraffe, it has a definite sort of African savanna type niche where it's eating up high on the trees. As things change over time, it takes a little bit of time for the changes in the survival rates to add up to breeding differences. So the long-necked giraffe, it took a little bit of time for there to be sort of this super long-necked giraffe, but that was just descent with modification, and the neck got longer and longer and longer. So Darwin had to produce evidence about evolution to say that yes, this is definitely going on. And that was part of his famous treatise, which he published in the book On Origin of Species. So what did Darwin specifically look at when his ideas landed? What was there? Darwin pointed to quite a few things. And obviously artificial selection would be in the list, but specifically things he could point at would be items in the fossil record, the fact that we find these fossils distributed all over the world. We see dog-like skeletons in regions all over our planet. How is it that that just happened by chance? We see similar adaptations in dogs. We see dingoes in Australia. We see coyotes in North America, right? We see things like kind of dog-like, I guess, more or less. See hyenas on savanna. Amazing, the geographic distribution of things that are very, very similar. Even the big cats, when you look at the predatory mode of hunting, from the snow leopard to the lion to the puma to the cougar, the geographic distribution of similar body types is quite striking. They all look like the same template, but they're different depending on the environment you go in. Homologous structures was another, and embryological development is another one we'll look at. These main characteristics. So as you dig up fossils, as you start to see skeletons changing, and this can happen with hominid skeletons moving towards modern times, from Australopithecines up to modern humans, there's a definite progression of the skeleton. By looking at the rock layers, you know that the things found in way down deep would be the oldest. Now, we have an advantage today because what Darwin couldn't do is he couldn't exactly date the rock layers. But he did know through the law of superposition that the youngest layers would be the newest things, and that the older rock layers contained ancient fossils. Okay, so let's pop out for a second and look at a few of these. A good place to start when looking at the fossil record, you can look at the evolution of the hominid skull. It's with what we've managed to discover, dug out of the ground. Go back a little bit in time, and by a little bit, I mean quite a bit. Australopithecines, or Australopithecus, whichever way you'd like to say it, 2 to 3 million years old. You definitely see a human-like or hominid-like skull here, just with much larger proportions. And looking at this over time, as we start to line up the skulls in particular, what becomes striking is how the relative brain case gets quite large for Homo sapiens, and how the jaw starts to shrink inwards. And we can see a definite progression, how the body began to change with the skull. Another interesting point is that we are bipedal. So bears, for example, can be bipedal, but not all the time. Bear, for example, will stand up on its hind legs to survey the environment around it. Well, that's not a common thing bears do all the time, because they spend a lot of time quadrupedally, which means on all fours. When you examine the skull of critters, for example, quadrupeds like a dog, the entrance of the spine is at the back of the skull, which makes sense. It inserts in the back, it spends all its time on all fours. When you look at some of these ancient hominid skeletons, this thing called the foramen magnum is nearer to the back of the head, which makes sense even when you think of sort of modern critters like the chimpanzee that are similar to humans in a lot of respects, they have the foramen magnum not in the center, but nearer to the back, because they don't spend all their time in a bipedal existence. And as we get towards, we get further progression as we move along towards our modern existence, that foramen magnum is smack dab in the middle of the skull. It's a little piece of evidence. It's not overwhelming, but it's another piece of evidence to suggest the evolution of bipedalism, and it goes hand in hand with the evolution of these organisms here. Now remember, if you ever see a movie and you see a pterodactyl basically hauling a human off to the nest to consume, pterodactyls 65 million years ago, the most modern hominids that we're finding are between 2, 3, and maybe upwards of 4.5 million years ago, depending on what they've been able to discover lately. So kind of have to take that with a grain of salt. There were no humans hanging around at the time of the dinosaurs. We are much, much younger. So pop back into our lesson here, and we'll finish this off. I've had time to go over this in quite a bit of detail, which is nice when it's recorded. There we go. So looking at the fossil record, we looked at quite a few things there, and of course we're not just looking at humans when it comes to it, but the fossil record is just amazing. When you find these little critters, these are trilobites, and they indicate that segmentation is a very ancient trait. There's the segments you can see there. Modern day equivalent of this, horseshoe crab, if you've ever seen those. If you haven't seen it, Google horseshoe crab and you'll see what I mean. We find all sorts of things in the fossils. We find fossilized imprints of hands, and when we see this, we begin to do our analysis. We see 5 digits, and we see a radius and an ulna. Common traits. Fairly interesting when you pay attention to it. We can track the progression of the evolution of teeth. Hopefully you wouldn't get caught by this one out in the open. Nasty. So Darwin had some interesting things to say about the same critter geographically distributed in different ways. If we look at something that's sort of large and rodent-like, like the beaver, and we look all over the world, we see a very interesting progression. Now, the beaver has an amazing pelt, and the Hudson's Bay Company was founded with the success of just trading that thing. As we move down throughout the world, we see other beaver-like things. We see the capybara in South America, this little guy here, right? Coypu, another relative. And we see beavers, we see muskrats, we see capybaras. They're all versions of what appears to be the same kind of large rodent body design, but with different modifications. So why are they different? Well, they're in different environments. Those environments have different demands, and it's like pressure on that body type. It develops in different ways to be successful in its environment. That is what Darwin proposed. Geographic distribution is just natural selection in different places. Darwin also saw these things called homologous body structures, and homologous is a neat term because what it means is comes from 2 parts. Homo meaning same, and logos meaning more or less structure. We'll run with that. So homologous structures, if we talk about your hand and your arm, these come from similar embryonic tissues. Your arm develops from the same general kind of region. When we look at, let's say, the arm and the wrist and the hand and the bones and all that contained in similar critters, we find similarities. So humans, whales, dogs, cats, cows, horses. Really, we're talking about mammals. Well, let's do a comparison straight up and look what's in their arms. Heck, we might even look at fish while we're at it. looking at chordates, anything with a stiff rod up its back, we can see that there is a radius and anola in each of these arms. We can see what amounts to some wrist bones and bones, carpals and metacarpals to be exact, in the hand. It's a little bit different depending on each creature, right? The alligator, of course, puts his hand down with much firmer support. The turtle has it inside of a flipper-like structure. The bird has a wing. Even in the mammals, along the lines of something that's sort of horse-like, we see the same bones are existing. So what explains this? Go back to an ancient relative, the lobed fin fish. And by lobed fin fish, what we're talking about here would be something like the coelacanth. Now, before I go there, the bones are basically all there. So you got a strong bone structure, and you don't see this, for example, in your typical rainbow trout. But if you go to one of our most ancient fish relatives, and we do a little bit of hunting, we see that those bones are in the lobes of the coelacanth. Now the coelacanth is this ancient fish here, and it's able to prop itself up. And in fact, you can see it perching. Oops, that's the guy I wanted. It can perch on those lobes. Those are incredibly large structures, and it almost looks like the origin of limbs, just barely south of the fins. In the course website, I have a neat little video on the coelacanth, and I wonder if he's in here. Just a second. Quickest way to find it is we'll go coelacanth, and I'll just call up the video. It's a tremendous fish. This is one that I have as evidence of evolution on the course site, I believe. Give it a second to load, and you'll see this coelacanth up close, very strong structures. Give it a second to load. There we go. And there we are. So we call it a living fossil because we thought they were extinct, but they're not. Go to a larger picture here. I'll even zoom in a little bit. And you can see that those aren't your typical fins. They can perch on them, and you wonder, well, what did they do with these things? Well, if by chance you wanted to get something to eat that was on land, and you can perch on fins, well, these aren't quite limbs, but it's the next best thing, fins that you can perch on. Also, my little friend here, the coelacanth. Just before I go to this, I want to show you the mud skipper. You can see those fins. Tremendous fleshy origins. Mud skippers are another example of this. Looking at mud skippers, you wonder, well, why would fish come up on land? Well, fish come up on land, and the mud skipper is a prime example of that. Look at how it's using its fins.
A mud skipper, a fish that spends most of its life out of the sea. The answer lies in the
There
mud.
you go. The use of limbs, well,
as the tide retreats,
the use of their fins as if they're limbs. This is very interesting. I tweeted this one out just the other day.
Tiny plants and animals.
So the mud skipper, the coelacanth, that's all pointing to life on land. Because it's an advantage to be on land. There's food there. Okay. So when Darwin presents his case, when he looks at homologous structures, if you compare the limbs of different animals, you see it's more or less the same limb. You see the radius and the ulna. In each of these cases, these are homologous structures. You could see it in each, but they're adapted slightly differently. For example, in a bat, the bat doesn't walk around. It has finer bones, and the digits, well, they're different depending on the mode of existence of the critter. In the bat, the digits provide the area for the wing canopy more or less to be attached. In the flipper of a whale, well, that just gives it that length to extend the flipper and to just have more to use in the water, if you will. So homologous structures, they're all the same bones, but they're differently developed, but they have the same common origin. We also see something called vestigial organs. Now, if you've ever looked at your cat or your dog, you might have noticed the third eyelid. You know, that's kind of creepy. When they're asleep, you just kind of open their eye a little bit, and you'll see a membrane going across. Well, the closest thing in you would be that tear duct, that one in the corner of your eye that you clean out, that has the, I hate to say it, but the meat in it in the morning. These are structures in us, for example, that leftover third eyelid that we don't need anymore, that we say are vestigial. Vestigial means it's sort of fading from our existence. It's a leftover. It's something that we don't need, and it's like it's evolving out. Whales, for example, have these little hip bones down here. Well, it makes sense that they're highly reduced in size because whales don't really need hips, because hips are meant for legs. Okay, I was running low on power there, so I had to plug in. Finally, when we look at another example of a vestigial organ, just in this case, one that we know quite well, if you've ever had appendicitis, your appendix, now what we're looking at is this structure here that I've highlighted in yellow. Your appendix is an interesting little piece of anatomy. As your small intestine, if this is the last part of your small intestine, your food passes through here and then enters into your colon, your large intestine, and begins to go up and sideways and then down as it's being processed. Your large intestine removes a lot of the water and is responsible for the formation of feces. Now down here, I have this little tongue-like organ, and it's a little bit of an evolutionary leftover. It's meant for cellulose digestion, like plant material. Since we're not really goats anymore, and I'm being facetious, but I'm having fun with it, we don't digest plant material. It's not our primary mode. We're not eating heavily cellulose fortified food, and we don't really need this thing anymore. It has less of a role, but it can get infected, and there are bacteria in here, which when you look at ruminants, for example, like cows, the bacteria in there can significantly aid the digestion of plant material. Well, we still have this organ, and if this bursts in our body cavity, it's a big problem. Appendicitis, it would be that pain on the lower right side of your body, and your doctor would most likely put you on a table and push down. Once he or she had been made aware of your pain, would push down, and when they let their hands up, that rebound pain, if there's rebound pain there, it's a good indicator, not the sole indicator, but a very strong indicator that there's an inflamed appendix. And you don't want this thing bursting in your body because it's full of all sorts of germs, and you don't want that cast into your body cavity. So that's another vestigial organ, interestingly enough. A third example, I don't have a picture of it, is people who can wiggle their ears a little bit. They still have developed muscles around the edges of their ears. They can wiggle their ears or turn their ears slightly. Evolutionary leftovers. Why would we have that? Well, when I talk to my pooch Bailey, he's a nice black lab shepherd cross, he can move his ears just about in any direction, and if I say walk, those ears point directly at me. Well, the ability to move your ears is a way of, for example, with canines, of sensing their environment. My cat does it too. It's something we don't do in humans. Our ears are on the side of our head, so we've been losing that sort of evolutionary heritage. It's vestigial, but it indicates a common relationship with some of our ancestors. Similarities in embryology is another one. Um, I'll go through what's on the slideshow here, then I want to pop out to a picture. We develop similarly, whether we're fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals. Our embryonic cells develop in the same regions. And as we develop, we get some really interesting similarities. This one points out, I'll just let it adjust, there we go, that chickens have these little gill pouch regions here. They call them pharyngeal gill pouches right there. And if you think about it, why are they kind of getting these pharyngeal pouches? They almost look like gills. And they get a tail that goes past the anus. A little bit hard to see, but the anal region would be approximately here. So we post-anal tail. Well, humans don't have tails. I get it with the example of when we're looking at a chicken embryo, come over to the human, and you see the same gill pouches early on in development, and we see the post-anal tail. And we still have a tailbone. Now, it's highly reduced once we develop, but as we're developing, we see that similarity in embryological development. So let's pop out for just one sec. If you think about embryological development, as our DNA turns on and starts to formulate a human, or fish, amphibian, bird, reptile, or mammal, it's the early going of creating the scaffold for a living thing. So embryological development, got to be able to spell. There we go. Comes up fairly quickly. We'll look at this in a full-size way. Not a bad little diagram. I'll just zoom it so you can see it. Fish, salamander, reptilian, something avian like a chick. And as we move into mammals, in the early going, the post-anal tail is there, and you can see the development of our supporting structure in our spines, our vertebrae here. There's the gill pouches showing up in pretty well each case. As we get into a later stage of development and the fish-related genes and the hog-related genes and cat and human, when they all show up, we start to look very different at this point. But we have some striking similarities when we begin. Well, the only reason you would have these similarities is if you had some genes in common. These things don't get put together this way by accident. And it's not until late stage that we really, our very different genes start to take hold. It's pretty striking, though, when you look at hogs, cats, rabbits, humans. At this point, you can tell which one is which, but they look really similar. Go back one level, it's kind of hard to tell them apart. It suggests a common heritage. It suggests evolution. Okay, pop back out. This is a pretty big topic. It's not one that you can really even cover in an hour, so it's nice for me to be able to record this. As we've moved forward and have had a chance to dig up more fossils and do genetic analyses, we can even examine DNA nowadays and see that mice, for example, are 90% genetically similar to human beings. We've been able to put more data to support Darwin's hypotheses about natural selection. Evolutionary theory is a field that just keeps getting more and more information, and it's pointing to the same conclusions. So I don't think I'll make you take a quiz. I'll leave it at that. To say that the theory is finished, to say that we know it all, far from it. But what we do know is that there's really strong support that critters evolve over time, and they do so in response to their environment. But one of the things that hasn't really been covered well enough is a genetics case for this. Why is this so? And that is a great course in university. You get a chance to take it. Genetics it gets my A+ recommendation. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening, and have a good one.